this podcast, the Heidelminicast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Did Calvin and Ursinus teach hypothetical universalism?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
You know what to do. Download the app at the Apple App Store or Google Play Store. Subscribe to the Heidel blog at heidelblog.net/subscribe and subscribe to this podcast in any podcast app.
The Heidelcast.
All right, let's get to a text message here. It's 760-618-1563. By the way, you can send voice memos to Heidelcast at heidelblog.net. Just record it on your phone. Use your voice memo function and then just email it to us. We could spend money. It was proposed to me here recently that we could add a feature to the app, spend more money, so that you just hit a button and then record the voice memo on the app and send it to us. But I said no. No. I believe that the listeners to the Heidelcast are technologically savvy enough to be able to use the voice memo function on their phones. I'm going to grab my phone here and see how to do that. I know I've done it. Yeah, just now I don't remember how to do it. Hold on a second. Let me figure it out. I'll come back. Okay, well, I just confirmed what you already know, that I'm a moron. So
Is everybody dumb?
no, it's just I, Curly. What you do if you have an iPhone anyway is to run the Memos app. So I'm just typing in, voice memos. So I just went up to you pull down on the screen. I just did it with my right thumb and then typed ME, and that brought up the Voice Memos app. And then hit that Memos app on your iPhone and hit the red recording button. Clark, how come you don't do a better podcast? So there it is. And I have a memo now. And then hit the three dots under what says on my phone, new recording 3. So I've only used this 3 times. That's why I didn't remember. And then hit share. I hit share, and then one of the many things you can do is email it, right? Just hit the email, hit the mail app, and then send it to Heidelcast at heidelblog.net. So that's not too difficult. And that way you don't have me harassing you for even more funds to fund an app or a new function on the app. So anyway, that's how we try to keep the costs down. All right, this is from Jordan, and it says, "Hello, Reverend Dr. Clark." Well, hello, Jordan. That's rather formal, but okay. My question is, how popular was hypothetical universalism among the reformers? I have heard some people say Ursinus was a hypothetical universalist. I have heard that Calvin was as well, but less frequently. I am told this. Also, how is hypothetical universalism viewed in NAPARC churches? Thank you. Well, this is an interesting question, Jordan. There are people out there on social media and also doing some academic work trying to gin up enthusiasm for hypothetical universalism. And when this sort of thing happens, then questions start coming in. The short story about hypothetical universalism is that it was a 17th century movement. I don't have any clear sense that it was taught by 16th century Reformed theologians. And in that sense, it's an anachronistic question. That is, it's a little bit like asking Calvin, what he thought about Arminius theology, right? Because the first person that I know of clearly who was teaching or headed towards hypothetical universalism is Bishop Davenant, who was a delegate to the Synod of Dort. And some have tried to use the fact that he was a delegate at Dort to sort of baptize his views as orthodox and sort of cover them with the credibility of the Synod of Dort. And The fact is, the Synod of Dort showed no sympathy with hypothetical universalism. You might be wondering, listener, well, what is hypothetical universalism? In short, it holds that Jesus died to make salvation available for everyone. In other words, he died for everyone, and then they limit the atonement by pushing it back a step. So Jesus' intention was to die for everyone, but only the elect actually benefit from it. It's honestly, in my view, and this is not just my view, this was the view of at least one later 17th century Dutch Reformed theologian. And just at this exact moment, I can't remember who it was. I just saw this the other day. Yeah, I remember now. It was Wilhelmus Abrakel. And I just checked the Heidelblog resource page on that. Did you know there's a resource page on hypothetical universalism? There is. And the easiest way to find it is to go to heidelblog.net/resources and just search for hypothetical universalism. And one of the pages you'll see there is a quotation from Wilhelmus Abrakel, The Christian's Reasonable Service. This is from the English translation, published in 1992. And this is from Volume 1, pages 222 to 223, on which Abrakel wrote, Amiro, who's the other major figure, who is really the major figure in the promulgation of hypothetical universalism, Amiro and all who follow him, Abrakel wrote, maintain to have found a middle position whereby, and this is the key point that I was trying to make, the offense of the true doctrine can be removed. They hold to the existence of two decrees. One is a universal decree, whereby God, being graciously disposed towards the entire human race, decreed to send Christ into the world so that he, by virtue of his atonement, would merit the forgiveness of sins and eternal salvation for all men, this being contingent upon faith in him, and they're not neglecting this salvation, T-H-E-I-R, just so you know what he's saying here. So they have to meet these conditions. To some extent, Abrakel wrote, God would then will the salvation of all men, and every man would be able to be saved if he would but exercise his will accordingly. To this they add a very special decree whereby God, out of sovereign grace, has chosen certain specific individuals unto salvation. By virtue of this decree, he will most certainly lead them to salvation, granting them, due to their natural inability, faith and repentance, and preserving them in this state by his power. From all this, a regenerate person may be assured of his salvation. As far as the first decree is concerned, Amyraldians are in agreement with Arminians and Lutherans, but are orthodox concerning the second decree. In the presentation of the sentiments of the various parties, it becomes evident that there is not merely one point of contention, but that various points of contention are intermingled. And then he goes on. I also commented on this issue in an essay, the title of which is Canons of Dort, number 19, Unconditional Atonement, and that will be on the resource page. And in the comments on that post, when we were discussing some of these issues, I have a quotation from Richard Muller on Calvin and Amyro, because from the very beginning, the Amyraldians, beginning with Amyro in the 17th century, claimed to be the true heirs of Calvin, and this has been a bone of contention between Orthodox Reformed people and Amyraldians ever since. Amyro and his followers claimed to be the true heirs of Calvin, and you see that in R.T. Kendall's book, Calvin and English Calvinism, and in Alan Clifford's book on the Atonement. They both make this argument. But there's an interesting passage here in Muller where he writes, as to Amyro's reading of Calvin's exegesis, it stands quite clearly as a use of Calvin's text that observes its basic pattern of a promise of salvation or reconciliation on condition, the qualification that hovers in the background of the promise, that the condition can only be met by a divine act of creating it in the individual, and the eternal decree or counsel to bring about this condition and consequently salvation in the elect alone. It matters little to the argument that the condition in Calvin's interpretation of Ezekiel is repentance and obedience, and Amyro's condition is faith, although this is an easily identifiable difference of interpretation. Amirault, however, builds on Calvin's argument and indeed claims to be interpreting and clarifying it by arguing two mercies and two wills in God where Calvin did not. This is a really big point. So the Amiraultians, and anybody who teaches hypothetical universalism, has to posit two decrees or two wills, and the Orthodox simply don't do that. The Synod of Dort explicitly denounced the Remonstrants on this point for teaching two kinds of election. And the Reformed have always said, no, there's only one kind of election. This is one reason why the Federal Visionists run afoul of Reformed Orthodoxy in the Synod of Dort by positing two kinds of election. Muller goes on, in fact, where Calvin had specifically stated that the will of God is one and simple, albeit with distinctions that can be observed in its revelation, where Calvin resolved the issue of the eternal call and particular election by simply declaring a resolution in the fact, as promised, the repentant are saved, Amirault indicated a double divine intentionality. Still, the way in which Amirault develops the covenantal argument in his exegesis does stand in positive relation to Calvin's language of a legal and an evangelical covenant, of which it is not a duplication but a development. Even if Amirault added, as he would do at the Synod of Alençon, that his language of two decrees was by rational distinction and intended without any succession of thought or order of priority and posterity, that's Amirault's language, in God, his exegesis still would differ from Calvin's in its postulation of two divine mercies and two intentions. So there's a fairly significant difference in thought between the way Calvin thought and wrote and spoke and taught and the way Amirault did. So that business of sort of reading Amirault back into Calvin is, in my view, a non-starter. As I said at the beginning, it's an anachronistic question because it only develops after Calvin. It develops after Ursinus. And so then we're turning around and asking people who died before the controversy, decades before the controversy arose, and asking their opinion of it. And that's always frustrating. And what happens is you get people drawing inferences. Well, he said this, and so I think this implies that, and that links to the Amiraultian view, or it links to the Orthodox view. Well, I think Muller has put his finger on the major issue here. And as I say, the Synod of Dort is, I think, impossible to reconcile with Amirault or with hypothetical universalism. So take a look at the resource page on hypothetical universalism, and you can see more stuff there. We've got the Helvetic consensus formula, which was a response by the Orthodox from Heidegger and Turretin and others, specifically to Amirault and to hypothetical universalism. And I have some quotations from, I think, a neglected figure in this debate. He was sort of marginalized by Brian Armstrong in 1969, but his doctoral dissertation, Roger Nicole's doctoral dissertation that I think he did at Harvard, if memory serves, in the 1940s, I think is very helpful. I found it very helpful. There's quotations from Charles Hodge and Packer and Owen and Turretin and Heidegger and Turretin and Bavinck and Warfield and A.A. Hodge and some articles, too, along the way, and also a bibliography. So take a look at that.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Heidelcast.
As to Ursinus' doctrine of the atonement, what sometimes people have done is that they have conflated his distinction, which really isn't his. It belongs to Peter Lombard, so it goes back centuries before Ursinus. But his distinction between the sufficiency of the atonement and the efficiency of the atonement, and they've perhaps taken that as some sort of indicator of sympathy for hypothetical universalism. But that's not what he's doing at all. But I do think his discussion of sufficiency and efficiency is useful for understanding how he thought about the atonement. That is, it is sufficient for everyone, He wrote, "Salvation through Christ is not bestowed upon all who perished in Adam, but only on those who by a true faith are engrafted into Christ and receive his benefits." And he adds that the reason that not all are saved is not any, quote, insufficiency of merit and grace in him, close quote. The atonement was, for Ursinus, sufficient for the sins of the whole world, but the intent of the atonement was particular. Yet the responsibility for condemnation belongs on those who do not believe, again quoting, because men reject the benefits of Christ offered in the gospel and so perish by their own fault and not because of any insufficiency in the merits of Christ, close quote. And he alludes to the underlying issue when he writes in response to an objection, quoting here, "But the reason why all men do not believe nor apply these benefits to themselves is a higher and deeper question, one which does not properly belong to this place," close quote. And he's referring to the doctrine of election and reprobation, which had been long taught in the church by Augustine and 9th century Augustinians and by Aquinas and late medieval Neo-Augustinians and the magisterial Protestant reformers, every one of them. So, the Remonstrants would challenge this doctrine in, for example, 1610, and the Synod of Dort is going to clarify that, and Ursinus is not dealing with all of that here, but we can see pretty clearly the structure of his thought on the atonement. I can just share this. You have to be very careful, and I was reminded of that in researching an answer to this question. I have to be very careful reading the English translation because there are later materials included in our English translation that are not actually written by Ursinus, and there isn't usually any indication of where the later material is being introduced. Sometimes there is. And so what I had to do was to sit down and look at a variety of Latin texts, trying to figure out what is Ursinus and what was added later. And the reason I mention this is because there is a section in Ursinus which actually favors the Orthodox view rather than the Emeraldian view under question 40 on for whom did Christ die? And there's an answer given there. But that material actually isn't from Ursinus. That is from Parius. And the only way you'd know that is by looking at the earliest Latin text, which I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's 1584. Ursinus died in 83. And then I think in 1602 or 03, you see that material appearing under question 40. That question doesn't occur in the 1584 text. It does occur in the 1602 or 03 text, and then it shows up in the 1612. And helpfully, in the 1612 edition, which somebody discouraged me from using some years ago, and I regret listening to that advice. That was a mistake. The 1612 is the best. And in fact, in the commentary, I didn't use the 1612, and I regret that too. But I used the Latin text, but I should have used the 1612 edition more than I did. Anyway, there is a marginal note in the 1612 edition that says addition, which is signaling to the reader that this is not actually Ursinus. What we need to do is to sit down, have somebody like Casey Carmichael sit down with the 1584 Latin text and make a brand new translation of Ursinus without the additions from Parius, and actually lay out the text the way it should have been laid out, and it's never actually ever been laid out. That'd be very valuable. So we'll have to put that on the list of things to be done.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
And as to the last question, what is the status of hypothetical universalism among the NAPARC churches? I don't think that somebody who announced themselves as a follower of Amiro or who said that they held to hypothetical universalism would be, I think, licensed or could sustain a candidacy exam, an ordination exam in the NAPARC churches, the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Council churches, and that's the PCA, the OPC, the URCNA, the ARP, the RPCNA, and I think there are others. There's a French Reformed Church in Quebec, It's included in there, and the Canadian Reformed are in there. Protestant Reformed are not members of NAPARC, I don't think, although very conservative. The Reformed Church in the United States, the old German Reformed Church, they are in there. And I don't think in the NAPARC churches anyway, and I'm pretty sure you couldn't do this in the Protestant Reformed churches either. I don't think you could say I'm an Amyraldian or I hold to Hypothetical Universalism and still be licensed or ordained, because it's contrary to the teaching of the Westminster Confession. It's contrary to the teaching of the Synod of Dort, and it's incommensurate with Reformed Orthodoxy. I was in classis meeting some years ago with a young seminary graduate who was being examined. Maybe you've heard me mention this before. And I heard him use some Amyraldian language, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And then in answer to another question, he used, again, more Amyraldian language. And so then I thought, well, once, it was a mistake. Two, maybe suggests there's something going on. And so during the Q&A period, after they finished that section of the exam, I stood. I don't even think I was a delegate. I think I asked for the permission of the floor. The brothers kindly granted it to me. And so I asked if he was an Amyraldian. And he said, well, yes, he was, or at least he had sympathies. And he was not licensed. And he did not end up entering the ministry of the United Reformed Churches. And I tell the students that, well, if you decide to become an Amyraldian and you try to get into this classis, and I find out about it, I will oppose you. And if classis sustains your examination, I will complain against that action, because I think it's a serious corruption of the evangelical faith.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.